Hello, we're back with the Conquered and the Proud today, and we're moving on, having looked at the Julio Claudian emperors, both in political terms fairly briefly, and then looking at the changes within the empire and what was happening outside, the conquest of Britain, that sort of thing. We're now moving on to a dynasty that are quite famous in some ways, even though they didn't last all that long, the Flavians. We're going to be looking at Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian, who succeeded him. Now, up until this point, apart from briefly with Claudius's son Britannicus succeeding him jointly with Nero and then being liquidated pretty quickly after that, emperors haven't been succeeded by sons by birth. Sons by adoption, yes, that's normal. This is one of those rare occasions where that happens. It's the blood dynasty that you haven't really had before, where you have a father and two sons succeeding him. This won't happen again until Marcus Aurelius is succeeded by Commodus, best part of a century after Domitian's death. Not quite, I mean, minus a few years. And that's an interesting pattern, is that how rarely Roman emperors actually had a son who outlived them and was considered at all a viable heir. So this is something unusual, but let's go back and let's look at a bit of narrative first and continue on. We very briefly at the end of the session on the Julio Claudians talked about the fall of Nero. It's gradual and then it's sudden. It's one of those things where he loses support successively from key groups. The big ones to go are the Praetorians. The Praetorian Guard turn against him, and then after that the Senate does openly. Now, plenty of senators have been privately critical. Plenty have been arrested, accused of treason, maestas, all of this sort of thing. You know, people like Seneca invited to commit suicide. So Nero's reign has begun with great hope, great success, and even Tacitus depicts this decline of someone who shows promise and is restrained by wiser heads around him, Burrus, Seneca, people like this. But as those fall away, as he disposes of them, as he comes under the influence of worse characters, he gets less and less restrained, more and more reckless in his spending, his behavior, you know, having these public performances of singing and playing the lyre, racing as a charioteer, going off competing in the Olympic Games, dressing as a woman, the reaction to the fire in Rome, the persecution of the Christians, which is seen as excessive and unfair, even though nobody particularly likes the persecuted group. Nevertheless, it's the emperor blaming somebody else for what most people feel he's actually caused. Whether that feeling is fair or not, it doesn't matter. That's the sentiment. But it's a gradual thing. Things have got worse and worse. The spending has got completely out of control, which means that there's been even more of an incentive to pick off some rich men so that you can confiscate their property, and the way that happens. So the maladministration has been there, and even though he's survived crises like the rebellion in Britain under Boudicca, you've got the big rebellion in Judea, things don't seem to be going so well. Yes, he's had the success, he's been able to declare the struggle over Armenia with the Parthians, a sort of proxy war almost, at times a real war, though mainly the clashes between the Romans and Parthians directly are relatively few. It's more to do with fighting armies where there are some allies from the other side. But nevertheless, he's got through that. But he's also then, Corbulo, one of his relatives, has been suspected of disloyalty. Corbulo, the commander who's won that war, who's achieved victory, but done it with great restraint, without actually as much fighting, much more armed diplomacy and threatening, he's told to go and commit suicide. So Nero has alienated more and more people. He's spent more and more. He's got out of hand. In a sense, the sort of traditional picture of Suetonius Tacitus is his true character has been exposed and has become less and less restrained. By any metric, you know, he's a bad emperor, particularly in the later years. The reign had gone reasonably well to start off with, but he doesn't do things very well. And that's a sign of people turning against him to an extent that doesn't really happen. You know, Caligula has to be murdered by a small conspiracy, but he's only been there 4 years. But there isn't this overwhelming rejection of him by the important people. And again, remember, it's the Praetorians who go first, the Senate follow afterwards. The Senate rarely initiates things, particularly as a group. So Nero finally, I always say that he commits suicide, people will point out, well, what he does is get his last attendant, his last faithful slave, to stab him. So I suppose it's getting somebody else to kill you, but it is his decision. Nero decides to end his life. You will have later on these stories that he somehow escaped. These imposters appear, pretenders claiming to be Nero in later years, up until quite late in the Flavian dynasty, and gains some popular support, though again it's moderate. They're never really a significant political factor. They don't come that far. But I think everybody accepts that the real Nero is dead, that these people are fakes. Now, there's been problems already. There had been a rising in Spain, proclaiming a chap called Vindex as emperor, one of the local governors. Nero has managed to suppress that, and has done this with the aid of troops that remain loyal. Fortunately for him, this rebellion has begun in an area where there aren't a lot of troops stationed there, so the pretender doesn't have an army to support himself. So that's suppressed, but then Galba will appear in Spain and gains the throne, gains support fairly quickly, so that by the time Nero's dead, there is an alternative around who is fairly quickly accepted, particularly by other senators. He goes to Rome, he promises great things and bounties to the Praetorians to support him, and is made emperor, adopts a son so that he can mark out an heir, suggesting there's a future, it's not just all on me, but is very quickly murdered and lynched by the Praetorians along with his heir, because he doesn't pay them the full money. It's partly one of those things. You promise great things and then you look at the state of the treasury, and thanks to Nero, there isn't a lot there. Right, Augustus is just coming past, but I think wants the door opened for him. So that's Augustus the cat, obviously, not the man himself, but who is in silent mode at the moment, so I don't know whether he will chip in. Oh, there we go. You can have a distant meow. Yes, there we go. Well, we'll see. I'm not quite sure what he wants, but we'll see in a minute. So Galba is out of the way. 3 months, that's it. He is succeeded by Otho, who bribes his way to power. Essentially, I will pay the Praetorians. So he's encouraged already this disloyalty, the sense of, oh, well, you're not getting the money from the emperor, so perhaps you need a new emperor. Vitellius then rebels with the backing of the armies in the German provinces that are still substantial at this period. The Rhineland is still probably one of the main concentrations of troops. Later in the rest of the first century and then beyond into the second, the balance of forces shifts much more to the Danube, or at least to further south between the Rhine and the Danube. But at this stage, Germany still has large provinces. The German legions back Vitellius. Again, you have these cases where it's a mark of rebellion. You tear down the imagenes, that are the images of the emperor and his family that are associated with the standards, that are carried as standards among them. That's a sign of rebellion. Maybe sometime we'll look more closely at how these mutinies, how these rebellions occur, the role of the centurionate, tribunes, officers like that. It rarely tends to be a spontaneous thing from the ordinary soldiers in the rank. It's officer-led to a fair degree, probably because they have more to gain from it, and who the emperor is matters rather less to you in the ranks. But if you are an ambitious man wanting promotion, then there's a lot more to be said for making sure that the emperor owes you a favor. So Vitellius rebels, he forms an army, marches down into Italy. There is a big confrontation, a very large civil war battle on a scale you haven't seen since Actium, really. And even then the fighting was less, but it's on that scale at Bedriacum, Cremona, near the Po in northern Italy. The Praetorians who fight for Otho prove militarily rather unimpressive. These are not troops that have seen a lot of service away from Rome or Italy itself for a long, long time. And they don't do very well, but nevertheless it's quite hard fighting, but there's a divided command. The whole army's improvised, it's lumped together, it's got groups that have been brought back by Nero for his planned expeditions that don't happen because of his fall from power. It's cobbled together. You've got several. Suetonius Paulinus, the man who's defeated Boudicca, gets caught up. He's one of the senators appointed as commander by Otho. Otho himself doesn't exercise battlefield command, nor does Vitellius. They get other men to do it. There's that sense of distance, and that pattern follows through. Vespasian doesn't command in the field during the Civil War. So you have Otho commits suicide in the aftermath of this failure. Vitellius comes into Rome, and you have your third emperor in less than a year, is proclaimed. He stations lots of the troops he's brought with him in Rome for a long time, leading to an outbreak of an epidemic. Tacitus emphasizes that these are frontier soldiers, and it seems to imply the legionaries as well as the auxiliaries have never been to Rome, never seen a city like this, are unfamiliar with it. It's very alien to them, and they seem very alien and almost barbaric to the inhabitants of Rome. So there's friction, disease breaks out, they're not used to the conditions. But nevertheless, he's firmly in control, at least of Rome itself, though that's because he's got a big army. By this time, Vespasian, who has been sent by Nero to suppress the Jewish rebellion, which broke out in 66, and we'll look at this in more detail in our next session when we look at resistance and rebellion in this period, but we'll look particularly at the Jewish War and how that played out, and I think we'll do something else more detailed on that at another point. He's been sent by Nero in 67 to take charge of the war there, controlling an army of between 3 and 4 legions, depending on the period you're dealing with, and there are Vexallation's detachments sent from Alexandria. Now, Vespasian has accepted the accession of both Galba and Otho, and in fact has sent his son Titus, who's serving as the legatus, the commander of one of the legions in Vespasian's army, sent him in person. He's begun his journey to go to Rome and pledge loyalty to the new emperor. But before he's got anywhere near Rome, in each case, Galba and then Otho are dead. At this point, seems to reflect a view of Vitellius. It also may be a sense of opportunity. Vespasian develops ambitions of his own. The governor of Syria, there's a separate governor in Syria. Vespasian is commanding the army in Judea, which has been turned into a province on a senatorial scale because of the war. It hasn't been before. Again, come back to that another time. Mucianus and Vespasian form an alliance. Vespasian is made the candidate for the throne. Mucianus is willing to back him. So again, there's quite a lot of signs of tension between them later on, but nevertheless, they are willing to collaborate on the basis that they feel they will do badly under Vitellius, or perhaps they do genuinely feel Vitellius is just the wrong sort, the wrong character to be emperor. Neither Vitellius nor Otho, in particular, get a terribly good write-up from the sources. Galba is seen as too much of a disciplinarian. But generally, you know, if they are vices, if he has faults, they're ones that fall within just an extreme form of traditional Roman virtues. Otho and Vitellius are men who've been popular under the dodgier emperors, under the Caligulas, under the Neros earlier on. They are seen as dissolute, poor men of poor character. So there might be that element as well. You've also got Tiberius Alexander, one of those rare cases of a Jewish aristocrat who's decided to take service in the Roman state and has accepted that there's some element of compromise with his religion, but has become prefect of Egypt. So Egypt, remember, is an equestrian province. It's not governed by a senator, even though it has 2 legions there, part of them will be involved in the Jewish rebellion. It's not commanded by a senator, nor are the legions there commanded by a senator, and senators are not allowed to visit without express permission. But it is a major province. It's the equestrian province that is the equivalent of the big senatorial provinces in a way that none of the others are, at least at this stage, until you get to Septimius Severus, over a century later. So these are the 3 main players, but other governors within the wider Eastern Mediterranean, where there aren't many other military provinces, but then it will extend into the Danubian provinces, they all begin to side with Vespasian. He is proclaimed emperor, the army acclaims him, and then sends an army to Italy. Again, he doesn't go in person, at least not at first. He follows on, though he will appoint Titus eventually to suppress the rest of the Jewish rebellion. It helps that by late 68, early 69, essentially all the main Jewish strongholds, apart from Jerusalem and a few minor places like Masada, have all been captured or surrendered to the Romans. So the main part of the Jewish rebellion is over. There is still an independent Jewish state based in Jerusalem, but it doesn't control much more than territory around it, and there's no real sign. The rebels have never mustered a field army that's proved at all effective, has shown any chance of taking the Romans out on in the open. So that you have that relief. He's got that opportunity. He's not abandoning a war that is still blazing furiously. This is rather like Boudicca's rebellion after the big battle where Boudicca's been defeated. The war's still going on, but the result is now inevitable. The Romans are bound to win. And it's just a matter of time and suppressing one stronghold after another. And there aren't many left. Obviously, Jerusalem is the really big one. As Vespasian's troops move into Europe and march, they are joined by troops from the Danubian provinces. And there is a second battle when they reach Italy, fought in much the same area as the first, around Bedriacum, Cremona, that area. This time they win. It's a battle fought partly at night, which is interesting. And it ends with the storming of Cremona and the sack of the city that is seen as particularly brutal. Population's been swollen by a festival, and soldiers just run amok. And there may be, elements of this is what you expect to happen in civil war. It's like going back to the stasis of Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, of how it just gets worse and worse and more savage. Tacitus goes into great lengths to describe the massacre, the rape, the murder that occurs in the aftermath of this, and is inflicted primarily on a population that has no real part in the war, has just been caught up in it, and are Romans, are Italians. It is a brutal thing, but it does decide the war. The army marches on, they will occupy Rome, Vitellius will kill himself, and eventually when he arrives, Vespasian is proclaimed emperor. So it's the end of the civil war, mainly anyway. Something else has happened in late 69, 70, where rebellion has occurred in the Rhineland, centering around the aristocracy of the Batavian tribe, spreading eventually to the 8 cohorts that are of Batavians that have been serving with Otho's armies. They've been on the losing side, and then they've been sent away by Vitellius. And then they rebel. But before that, Julius Civilis, a Batavian aristocrat from the royal family who's been under suspicion of disloyalty, he rebels, other units defect, and over time it becomes a big rebellion. At first they proclaim that they're fighting for Vespasian against Vitellius, but as Vespasian wins, they then declare an empire of the Gauls, the idea of this independent state that's supposed to be, they're calling it the Gauls, though it's Germanic peoples that are in the lead, and they're aristocrats. They besiege the remnants, the rump part really, they're not full-strength legions at Vetera. These surrender, many of the troops defect, so you end up with a Roman army that's got legions, that's got lots of auxiliary cohorts, that's got local levies, tribesmen, this sort of thing, is now proclaiming basically a separatist empire. This is suppressed by Petilius Cerealis, the man that we've encountered before. He's the one who's commander of the 9th Legion at the time of Boudicca's rebellion and leads a large part of that legion into defeat and destruction, though he escapes himself. He's a relative of Vespasian, which is probably why he's trusted with the job. He will later go back after this to Britain and govern there. So Cerealis suppresses the rebellion. It's probably not as savagely punished as we used to think. People used to draw parallels with the 1857 mutiny of the armies in Bengal, the Indian Mutiny, or Sepoy Rebellion, or the Great Rebellion, or whatever you choose to call it. There's obviously controversial and political aspects in just how you define what that was. And after that, apart from the reduction in importance of the Bengal army and the populations from which those regiments tended to be drawn, and reliance more on the martial races as they came to be called, Sikhs, Punjabis, Gurkhas, Baluchis and others. and that for a while then, until the First World War, Indian troops were given an older pattern rifle than the British troops. They weren't given field artillery, only mountain artillery, this sort of thing. And there were more officers sent to the unit, more British officers, to ensure them, and there was always this emphasis on there being a British battalion in every brigade, and so on. There was a sense, and I think perhaps a lot of Victorian and early 20th century British scholars tended to think naturally along those lines, that something similar would happen. Doesn't seem to have been the case. What's unfortunate is that Tacitus' description is very detailed but breaks off when the histories comes to an end, what survives of it, before the suppression of the rebellion. So we don't really know how much compromise was involved, and whether they were able to fudge this and say, okay, really actually we're rebelling against Vitellius and so were we, and we can see about that. A couple of legions are disbanded permanently, the men transferred elsewhere and reformed because they've changed sides and they've rebelled against the Romans. So there is formal disgrace of some units, and there probably are executions and punishments, but Batavians seem to go on providing distinct units that are led by Batavian aristocrats for at least another generation afterwards. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. So that's the rise to power of Vespasian. Let's look a little bit at the man himself. Flavius Vespasianus, the Flavii. It's not an old aristocratic family. They're definitely not patrician, but they're not part of the plebeian aristocracy that's dominated the Republic for the last few centuries. They're an equestrian family from Italy, so they are Italians, but they've been of that class one step down from the Senate, and they have become pretty wealthy, but a lot of the wealth, particularly in the Vespasian's early career, and perhaps his father as well, comes from breeding mules for sale, particularly to supply the Roman army. And it's a very profitable enterprise. It isn't a particularly honourable or distinguished one. It's not the same as having large estates from which you produce a great surplus of crops, which you then trade. That's proper gentlemanly stuff. Interestingly enough, you think back to Ventidius Bassus and people like that who've come through a similar route, the sort of supply end, the contractor almost for Roman military enterprises. Vespasian does well enough to seek a senatorial career, no doubt pushed by a father. His brother Sabinus appears to have followed an equestrian career. Now, Vespasian was legatus of Legio II Augusta in 43 when it takes part in the invasion of Britain. And we've mentioned him last time when we looked at the conquest of Britain. He gets a largely independent command after the initial campaign against the Cacciaviloni Trinovantes, and it's described as how he captures the Isle of Wight, Vectis. Two tribes submit to him, probably the Durotriges Domnoni. He captures a large number of oppida, places like Maiden Castle, Hod Hill, and others, the many large multi-banked hill forts that are in that area. So he does well. It's a distinguished military career. It's not spectacular, but it's very good for a new man, which is what he is. So, he's like a Cicero in that respect. He falls out of favour at various times with Caligula. There's a story of him being in charge of keeping the streets clean and this sort of thing, and Caligula not being pressed and, pouring dung down his tunic and all this sort of thing. He falls out of favour. He comes back into favour at various times. There's some influence at one point from some of the women of the imperial family. They seem to help his career. Antonia, for instance. But then Agrippina doesn't like him so much. He falls out of favour. He comes back in. There's a story that he falls asleep during one of Nero's performances, which obviously does not please the emperor. On the other hand, his career revives, even if it's unspectacular. He's sent to govern Africa Proconsularis, the North African province. Again, depending on Suetonius or Tacitus' point of view, he either does very well there or rather poorly. Perhaps he's corrupt, perhaps he's greedy for money or gains that reputation. There's one anecdote has a riot where he's pelted by turnips by an angry crowd, all this sort of thing. You wouldn't look at Vespasian and see him as a potential emperor at any of the stages of his career, really, until he happens to be in charge of a major army in the chaos after Nero's death. He's well into his 50s when he's sent by Nero to take charge of Judea after the initial attempt to march on Jerusalem, suppress the rebellion and stamp it out in 66 by the Syrian governor has failed. It's now, okay, that didn't work, let's do the job properly. Let's mass a proper army, supply it, and then systematically retake all these walled cities that the rebels are holding. Titus goes with him, as I say, to command the legion, 15th Apollinaris, and however, Domitian, the younger son, is kept back in Rome, potentially as a hostage. You could argue that one of the reasons Nero gives him Vespasian such a big command is, yes, he could be saying, oh, well, you know, this chap did well in Britain, but he hasn't commanded a military province before this point. It may actually be that you look at his family background and think, well, this fella is too obscure to be a threat. You know, I don't have to worry about him. No one is going to see him as a potential emperor because who's heard of the Flavii, and he's a new man. And his career is not spectacular up to this point. So there could be an element of, yes, you know, advisors actually say this man does seem to know what he's doing. He does seem to be a capable soldier. Let's send him. Or it might be this is, yeah, he seems a fairly capable sort of chap, but he's not a threat. He can't be a rival. And you let his son go with him, that's a favour, but it's also, you know, it buys into the same thing. Yes, okay, he's got Titus with him, but the whole family just isn't important enough to count too much, to be enough to concern me, make me worried. But you keep the younger son, Domitian, back at the imperial court. Domitian does not have a public career, really, to any extent. Sabinus is also in Rome around about this time. His career is sort of much later than Vespasian's and less spectacular. So Vespasian succeeds in bringing the rebellion under control. You know, he begins with the systematic reconquest of Galilee, comes up against Josephus as one of the local commanders, captures him after the fall of Jotapata, after a siege there. We get this, you know, wonderful description, and again, we'll go on to Josephus next time. Josephus claims that when he, having suggested a suicide pact with the other men hiding with him, manages to survive this when everybody else apart from one is dead, and the two of them decide, I know, let's not bother with that, let's go and surrender. Again, we'll come back to that later because obviously it affects how we consider his reliability. Josephus claims that he sort of grovels before Vespasian and foretells that he will become emperor. And that he's released from prison, imprisonment rather, when Vespasian does actually declare himself emperor. Maybe, you know, maybe it's the sort of thing you'd say when you're desperate, you'd forecast all of this sort of thing. Who knows? We'll come back to that. Suetonius presents Vespasian as really unlike everybody else. I mean, Suetonius is reasonably complimentary to Julius Caesar and Augustus. He criticizes them to some extent, but they are generally, particularly Augustus, presented favorably. Augustus is, in a sense, the model of what an emperor should be. All the other subjects, with the exception of Vespasian and to the lesser extent Titus, whose life is much shorter, they're men who are corrupted by power, who get worse, whose worst aspects, their character expresses itself more and more because they're not restrained, because they have supreme power so they can do what they like. In contrast, Suetonius argues that Vespasian actually improves once he becomes emperor. He becomes a better man. The only fault really for which he's criticized is avarice, that he's grasping, he needs more money, he's always looking for ways to raise revenue, raise tax, this sort of thing. Now, there's a good reason for that in that he inherits a treasury that has been drained by Nero and then damaged even more by the cost of the civil war. You know, these things do have consequences. So you get the nice story of when, after Vespasian's died and during his funeral, there's an actor wearing his funeral mask and his regalia, and there was a tradition that you'd make jokes with the crowd as the procession went along, and one of the jokes is supposed to be, he asks the crowd, well, how much did all this, this big show cost? And they call out a figure and he says, oh, that's far too much, just pay far less and just chuck me in the Tiber, sort of thing. It's interesting, there are a couple of, like Augustus, there are a few jokes preserved about Vespasian. I suppose the other most famous one is in his last moments saying, I think I'm becoming a god, sort of wryly saying, because he knew that emperors would be deified after their death, not before. So in 79, Vespasian dies. He's replaced by Titus. Titus has been commander of the Praetorian Guard under his father in those years of the reign, and has been the heavy, in a sense, the man who has come round, because there has been opposition. Senators have resented Vespasian, perhaps because of his birth, perhaps because of the the demands for money. You have Thrasea this stoic, philosophical circle of distinguished senators who rebel but don't really achieve very much. Titus succeeds, so he's been a little bit unpopular whilst head of the Praetorian Guard. He seems to become much more popular in his lifetime, and perhaps even more popular after his death, in contrast to his brother Domitian. He does, this is the time when Vesuvius erupts, the destruction of Pompeii, Herculaneum. He goes to great lengths to aid the survivors. It's the big theme partly of Mozart's La Clemenza di Tito. But he genuinely does this. He seems to be, again, an organizer. He has taken over command of the army in Judea, even though he's only 30-odd, when Vespasian goes off to seek power, and has completed the war, capturing Jerusalem in a 2.5-3 month siege. In 70, you've got the Arch of Titus there in Rome commemorating this victory. The money from that has helped to build the Colosseum, which is, you've moved the Colossus, the great immense statue of Nero that Nero had put up to honor himself. You've replaced the head with the sun gods, but you've moved that to build the Colosseum. The Flavian amphitheatre, as it's known, later becomes the Colosseum because of association with this big statue. That's come from the spoils of Jerusalem in particular, and Josephus and others talk about the value of gold dropping all around the Roman world because so much loot has come from this very large, very wealthy city. But Titus doesn't last long. He dies in 81. He doesn't have an heir other than his brother. Domitian succeeds, is much, much less popular. Now, he hasn't had a public career up until this point, not to any degree. He isn't a proven soldier. Josephus sort of flatters him by saying, oh, well, the rebellion on the Rhineland gives in. They surrender as soon as they hear that Domitian's going to be on his way. But he doesn't have that career. He's like a Caligula or a Claudius or a Nero. Not quite as young as Caligula or Nero, but fairly young. But he hasn't done anything. He doesn't have a proven reputation, and he is disliked. He does seem to have that ability to rub people up the wrong way. Because he's disliked, he tends to be more suspicious of everybody around him. One thing feeds another. You get the return of the maestas trials, these trials of somebody who's offended the majesty, the maestas of the Roman people. Suspected conspirators are punished. Domitian will be murdered in a palace conspiracy, not by a conspiracy of senators. He will suffer damnatio memoria, just like Nero and others, where his images are removed and smashed, his name is chiseled off monuments. That's partly because he doesn't have an heir from his own family to succeed him, but it's also a sign of how much he's alienated people. We'll come on to see whether or not that's fair or not in a moment or two. Now, there's a lot more to all of the rise of Vespasian and his reign and that of Titus and Domitian. It's rather like dealing with the Julio Claudians. We're skimming over things to a fair extent in this series because we're trying to give an overview of several centuries of Roman history. So let's focus on a few changes. One of the big ones, and one that's very convenient for scholars, is that Vespasian has his powers as emperor voted to him by law in one go. Law that's passed by the Senate, Senatus Consultum. Now, up until now, if we think back to what we've talked about with Augustus and the Julio Claudians, you mark somebody out as an heir, if you've got time, by gradually extending the powers like the Maius Imperium Proconsulare, the power greater than that of any other proconsul throughout the empire, the Tribunician Potestas, other honors, other titles are given in a sort of reduced version. So people like Agrippa earlier on, Gaius, Lucius, Tiberius later, they'll be given them for a period of so many years, or by the end of Augustus' reign, or Tiberius is given most of the powers for longer than that. This can't happen because obviously you've had the dislocation of the civil war, and it's been fairly scrappy. You know, there hasn't been a clear preparation. Obviously, Caligula has not marked out Claudius as his heir. Claudius has with Nero, supposedly jointly with Britannicus, but he's been given that progression towards being princeps. But Vespasian has no claim to any imperial connection whatsoever, not even vaguely. You know, there's no blood claim. He's not even part of the old aristocracy. So he has everything voted to him in one go. And because some of this survives, it gives us an idea of you know, just how these powers were defined. Because it seems to be a sort of codification of what's happened before rather than something particularly new. And from now on, this will be the pattern. When an emperor succeeds, the Senate votes him his powers as emperor. So it's in some ways a formalization of the position of princeps that Augustus occupied. He presented as something that was unique to him, that he had been honored with all these powers, responsibilities, and titles by a grateful senatus populusque, you know, grateful Senate and people of Rome. And that I'm not a king, I'm not a monarch, I'm simply the senior magistrate of the state. That deceit, really, you know, it's a facade, becomes thinner and thinner by this time. But nevertheless, the idea that the Senate is still the body that gives the emperor his power by this senatus consultum, it reinforces that sense you are a servant of the state, not the master of the state. Another thing he'll do is in 73 he resumes the censorship, revives that. Now again, that's something Augustus had done. The idea, get the census working it properly again. We'll know how many Roman citizens there are. Everybody's property can be recognized. Membership of the Senate, membership of any order can be, you know, the equestrian, all of these things can be recognized and set down very clearly. It's a sign that life is back to normal, the state is working properly, everything is functioning again. Vespasian takes it much, much further. Titus is his fellow censor. Domitian will also hold the censorship later on. And there is a very thorough revision of the senatorial role of membership with, again, something Augustus had done a little bit, but much more marked from now on. He creates lots of new patricians. So the patrician families have almost entirely died out. You know, there are very, very few of them left that genuinely go back to those few aristocratic lines of the early republic. They had been a minority of the Senate, even leading members of the Senate by the 1st century BC, if not before. The imperial period, the civil wars of the late republic, and then the imperial period has thinned their ranks even more so. And you do have this tendency, it's the big thing Augustus is on about all the time, I suppose it's almost topical these days, about the low birth rate, particularly amongst the aristocracy. You know, Augustus has brought in legislation to encourage people to have at least 3 children, and you get rewarded, you get extra status if you do that. But it isn't happening. The aristocratic lines tend to die out. They rely very heavily on adoption to get heirs, to get the next generation, which means that you're getting these people with long, you know, lists of names from all the family lines they've combined. Lots of property concentrated, they're very rich, but, and that's partly, you know, you don't want to be seen as a danger. It's partly the expense of putting a son in particular through a public career. But it is that complacency, well, I've got everything I need, I don't really do it. And of course, the imperial family doesn't set a terribly good example. Even though Augustus' extended family produces quite a lot of children, they don't live very long, largely because many of them come to violent deaths. But it's, you know, again, we come back to the point made earlier on, Vespasian is the first emperor with the qualification of Claudius and Britannicus, but obviously that doesn't work. The first emperor to be succeeded by a son, and then Titus is succeeded by a brother. You haven't had heirs of that close kinship before that have actually succeeded. They've been marked out, but they haven't got that far. And it's going to be another century before Marcus Aurelius passes on the power to Commodus. So you've got the creation of new patricians, one of whom we've already come across, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, the governor of Britain, the father-in-law of the orator Tacitus. The family has Gallic connections, but they're now a patrician, and you are ornamenting the Senate. You're trying to represent the Senate in the same way the Senate votes you your power as emperor. You are trying to represent the Senate as how it should be, a distinguished body of the most distinguished Roman citizens around, who guide the state by their wisdom, by their experience, and including guiding the emperor, who is simply the first magistrate. Again, all of this is a conceit. All of this is masking the reality, but it's an attempt to go back to that Augustan ideal. And it's perhaps no coincidence that Tacitus will write about the period from 14 onwards in the 2nd century AD. Suetonius writes about the 12 Caesars, and then there is a sense of judging them. What is a good emperor? What is a good leader? How should they behave? How should they act? And what's a bad one as well? So these ideas are probably developing at this point. So there is particularly under Vespasian and Titus, less so under Domitian, there is at least a pretense of consulting the Senate, senatorial debate about major issues. Domitian drops this. He's not interested. I mean, it's largely a formality that means very little. But on the other hand, again, these formalities can have they play a strong part in giving the mood to your government. And of course, it comes back to this. It's the senators and the equestrians who write the histories. So if you upset them, you're not going to get a good press. You are going to be rubbished once you're dead and out of the way. There's fairly strong government and ever tighter control over what provincial governors are doing. It's a little bit like, Sulla saying that governors shouldn't lead their armies outside their province without express permission. It's basically, don't do what I did. And you could argue it's the same with Caesar doing some of these things as dictator, and Vespasian. Now, I've won through a civil war, but I don't want anybody else to do what I've just done. Now, you can argue that's good and responsible and showing that you want the best for the state, but there's an element of hypocrisy in it as well. This is particularly true under Domitian. We see strong traces of this. Domitian keeps his governors on a very tight rein and seems quite willing to listen to criticism of governors from provincial communities, which doesn't make him very popular because obviously, again, the governors are senators and it's their class that's going to write the history. It's probably good for the provinces. It's probably good for the empire. But again, in the same way you've had this friction in the 1st century BC of these governors who want to just plunder the province to get back home as quickly as they can, and some people who are thinking, well, actually we have a responsibility. We want our empire to function, because we should, that's the right thing to do, but also from the purely pragmatic point of view, we don't want rebellions. They're expensive, they're dangerous. We want to keep people happy, and we want to keep making a steady profit rather than, it's back to the Tiberius comment, I want you to shear my sheep, not flay them. We'll come back to that when we look at provincial governorship in a few sessions' time in rather more detail. So Domitian isn't popular for this. The bureaucracy around the emperor, it's still tiny by any modern standards, but it starts to develop. You have the secretariat being organized, the abepistules, the people in charge of letters in both Greek and Latin, which effectively means different parts of the empire. A lot of this has been going on under the Julio Claudians, and Claudius in particular has relied on his freedmen to perform many of these tasks. Domitian takes great care to get equestrians in these posts. And Suetonius has his career starting then and continuing for a while within this imperial service. It's what will a little later give him access to private letters between Augustus and Livia and that sort of thing, before he's discredited in the early years of Hadrian, well, fairly early years of Hadrian's reign. So it's all made more formal. There's more departments, named officials in charge. Again, the Senate doesn't really like this because senators feel senators should be in charge and nobody else, and they don't like taking orders from anyone. They really didn't like it from freedmen, but even equestrians isn't quite the thing as far as they're concerned. So you get this opposition that seems particularly associated with followers of Stoic philosophy. And this is a group that has, over the last 100 years or so, idealized Brutus in particular as, you know, great hero of the Republic. Another Stoic, of course, and Cato, but Brutus in particular, because he stabbed Caesar. It's a little bit, you know, you've got the conspiracy of Thrasea mentioned before. It's not very effective. It's not really clear what they wanted. The sources are not good. We have a big problem in that Tacitus describes the civil war, the era of 4 emperors, and the beginning of the Batavian revolt in great detail, but then the histories break off, nothing else has survived. So we don't have a narrative history for the Flavians. You've got bits of Dio, but most of it is an epitome much later, not the full account. So you have Suetonius, but he's not really giving you narrative, he's giving you bits and pieces. So there are lots of bits we don't understand. There's also unpopularity because of the taxation that becomes heavier. Tends not to be, you know, again, the Romans avoid direct taxation on Romans. You don't have the equivalent of income tax, but you do on various dealings, on property inheritance in certain conditions. You know, citizens pay less, but nevertheless they pay something, and nobody likes paying anything. And any change in taxation, the immediate impact, because often it's something you haven't necessarily planned for, is difficult, but it's resented. You've got used to things a certain way and suddenly you're being asked for more. Nobody likes that. Yet you have to say that on the whole, the Flavians in general rule very well, that things seem to be efficient, the empire's working again, and it does recover from the extravagance of Nero, the poor decision-making of Nero, the disruption of a civil war that lasted on and off for over a year. So they've got a lot to do and they seem to do the job pretty well. Even Domitian's rule does appear to be fairly effective. You know, he's not always popular, he isn't always nice, he does annoy people, he does seem to have a temper, he can be vindictive, but he also appoints lots of people who do their job quite well, even if they're not necessarily the people that many senators feel should be in charge. You know, it comes back to the Claudius situation. In many respects, his freedmen did quite a good job. It's just people consider that they shouldn't be powerful, nor should Claudius be influenced by his wives and all this sort of thing. So the provinces get stability. They get, generally speaking, better government from the senators sent out as whether they're proconsuls in senatorial provinces or legati in imperial ones. They behave in a rather more restrained way than perhaps some have in the past, because Domitian will prosecute them and deal with them. And sometimes he's vindictive. You know, a governor of Britain is dismissed, a chap called Lucullus, because he's allowed a new pattern of lance to be named after him. That's dismissed and then basically liquidated. There is an interesting epigraphic suggestion that his bodyguard unit, which may have been the troops issued with this, gets sent away from Britain almost as a sort of, you know, punishment battalion and serves elsewhere. I can't remember if I mentioned that before. We'll come back to that in more detail another time. It's a bit too narrow for this. Domitian is damned by later senatorial historians, by Suetonius, who's not a senator but equestrian, but particularly by Tacitus, and it's reflected in Dio and elsewhere. The tradition for him is hostile. Tacitus is particularly vindictive, and you feel there's an element of he's got to clear his own name, because Tacitus' career begins under the Flavians, and he does rather well under Domitian, and survives into the next regime and does quite well under them again. So it's that looking around and saying, oh, well, you know, I was never really on his side afterwards. It's you could argue that the focus on the bomb plot, the opposition to Hitler in National Socialist Germany, distorts the fact that most of the main figures of this only begin their opposition when Germany starts losing the war. But it's, with hindsight, it's nice to focus. It's easier for everybody to say, oh, well, you know, there were good people trying to do the right thing and getting rid of them. Tacitus also, he has a tightrope to walk, because, as I say, he's done very well. And his biography of Agricola that praises Agricola to the skies, particularly his governorship of Britain, his victories in what would become Scotland, the Battle of Mons Graupius, all this sort of thing. Of course, this is somebody who's been appointed by the Flavians and wins those final victories under Domitian. Now, later in the book, it's, oh, well, Domitian is jealous of Agricola's success because Domitian isn't a great war leader himself and marginalize him afterwards. Well, you know, often the governorship of Britain is pretty much the pinnacle of a career And Agricola has done rather well out of things. So, but it's almost presenting it as, well, you can be a decent man under a bad regime or a bad ruler as long as your character remains pure and as long as you behave properly like a good Roman aristocrat and you do the right thing and you can show ability and you can win glory in that sense. It's Tacitus, in a sense, explaining, well, we were good people, we were doing our best. The emperor may have been bad, the emperor may have been cruel, he's a terrible man, but we were there trying to make sure that the state functioned properly, we were doing the right thing for the good of the Roman people. And it does mean that when he deals with opponents who commit suicide or get executed, condemned under the Julio Claudians in the annals, or the bits that survive of the histories, Tacitus often seems a little bit cynical. I mean, he's cynical generally, but he doesn't idealize these people. These are not martyrs who are good in every respect and to be admired in every respect. There's almost a sense of, sometimes he depicts them as people who are just making a show of opposition but achieving nothing at all. They died, what changed? Nothing. Yes, they made the point, yes, they stood on moral grounds and all this sort of thing. And it's in a sense an argument for, well, let's just knuckle under, but let's make sure we're not corrupted, we do the right thing, we personally do nothing wrong, and we can't change anything else, but at least we're making sure that the state is generally functioning better than it would be otherwise. And it's a difficult idea. But again, it's much easier to criticize when you haven't lived under that sort of regime and been in those circumstances than perhaps it is if you have, like Tacitus. So let's look at the provinces. Under the Flavians, there's a sort of sense of permanence grows now. You have, in many areas, particularly in Europe, the replacement of timber military bases with stone ones. That are, the timber ones have lasted fairly well. It's been timber, earth, turf, these things have been the main materials used by the army for a long time. But when you start building in stone, that's very much a sense that you are planning to be here for a long time. And there is a sense of the army taking root, of the frontiers taking root. There's another series of talks where we've been looking at grand strategy and frontiers. I will resume those when I get a moment. We'll probably do something on it in this Conquering the Proud series as well, a little bit later, more simply. It's a big and hotly debated topic, so it's one that I want to deal with in suitable depth. So we'll do both. But you get, most of this is only apparent in the archaeology. Again, it comes back to the fact we don't have good narrative sources from now on. The next detailed narrative source you get is Ammianus in the 4th century. You've got bits of Dio, but it's never quite as good. You've got Herodian Dio for the 3rd century a bit, but they leave lots of questions unanswered. You've jumped on from in 70, when Tacitus' Histories fails. We don't have any more of the scrolls after that. There are large periods where it's very difficult to know the basic day-to-day politics, military events, what's going on in the empire, certainly in any great detail. So archaeology becomes more important, as does epigraphy. There are, the original Limes Congress, and then there have been so many after these big archaeological conventions where the themes are frontiers, the army, the bases, how they're developed. It's a sign really of the type of evidence that this has been very much archaeologically driven. Archaeology supported by epigraphy, the inscriptions that may tell you who's there, what's being built, which units are there, this sort of thing. Career patterns of governors, of ordinary soldiers, of everybody in between. So you get really the beginning of the study of Roman frontiers tends to focus very much on this period when everything looks more permanent. And it's perhaps no coincidence that in Frontinus, this collection of stratagems of commanders that are, basically examples of how you should do things, how you outwit the enemy, how you win. There are very few that are from the Imperial period. They're nearly all Republican or Greek. There's far more Caesar and Hannibal and Scipio than there is, there's the odd one attributed to Corbulo. There is one told about Domitian, which is actually about building a line of forts amongst the Chatti and in that area beyond the the frontier in Germany, basically extending the frontier, occupying another area of land more directly, more permanently, and how this wins the campaign. So it's interesting that something we're seeing archaeologically, there's just that glimpse, and it's only one anecdote in many, so you can't push it too far. But there is, you've got this whole debate about grand strategy and this sort of thing, which we'll talk about another time. There are reductions in garrisons in most provinces. There is a move towards very few provinces by the 2nd century will have 3 legions in them. Most will go down to 2, and auxiliaries, and many will be smaller. It might be a changing military need. It might be a changing administrative role of the army. You know, you have as well, up until now, there have been a few bases that have had 2 legions stationed in them. That will cease because it's a sense that, you know, it's just too much money concentrated in their treasuries and too much power there. We've talked about Britain last time. It is a period of enthusiastic conquest. You've got governors who are supporters of the Flavians. Petilius Cerealis is a cousin. Frontinus has connections. Agricola is one of their men. The army in Britain had supported Vitellius, apart from Second Augusta, seemed to have stayed with, or at least were willing to support, Vespasian. And it might be that one of the ideas is to keep this army in a province where the army hasn't been to or has been loyal to an opponent, keep them occupied. You know, they haven't been so heavily involved in the defeat of Vitellius because they only sent some troops to that army. Let's make sure everybody there knows that Vespasian and his sons are keen on the army, enthusiastic to support and promote talent. So let's go here. But it might also be that Vespasian has personal experience of Britain, and that the situation, you've had Boudicca's rebellion not long before, there is a feeling that now we can push on with conquest, or now we need to make the rest of the province more stable. It's hard to know. You have the push into Scotland, or become Scotland, but that's abandoned in the late 80s, and there's a withdrawal. You go down from 4 legions to 3, and possibly by the turn of the century, you may have gone down to 2. So nobody's quite sure where 9th Hispana is at that point. 2nd Adjutrix goes in the 80s. And you've got 2nd Augusta and 20th Valeria Victrix. On the Rhine frontier, again, there's a lot of reforming right from the beginning, because obviously this is again where there's been the big rebellion, the revolt of Julius Civilis, the leader of the Batavians. However, the Batavians continue to be heavily recruited into the Roman army. They continue to form cohorts that are Batavian, and we now can see from the Vindelander writing tablets that at least the unit there is being commanded by Batavian aristocrats. So, you know, you have, when suddenly we saw this name Flavius Cerealis, the prefect of the 9th Batavians, you think, well, Flavius, that means he or his father, the family has got their Roman citizenship from the Flavian dynasty, from Vespasian, and Cerealis is the man who has suppressed the rebellion in the Rhineland. So you suspect that the man himself, or I don't know, well, probably a father, has either remained loyal to the Romans and the right Romans under Vespasian, or has switched sides early enough to be rewarded for it. You know, you have the reference to him as king in one of the writing tablets, suggests he's probably from the tribal royal family. So it's, again, it comes back to the point raised earlier. It's not like 1857, 1858 in India, where the British are terrified and radically reform the Indian army. It's less than that. You do, however, you've disbanded legions, you've formed new ones, you move them around to make sure that you're, you know, spreading out anyone who's potentially disloyal. There's also military needs changing. This is the start, under the Flavians, of the shift away from the Rhine towards the Danube. Basically, the bulk of the troops start to move southwards. The European frontier there on the Danube and to its north becomes more significant. But Domitian himself goes to campaign against the Chatti, one of those Germanic tribes. Tacitus, writing not long afterwards, talks about, you know, their military organization. Other tribes go out to fight a battle, the Chatti go out to fight a war. You know, how they organize their supply and all this sort of thing. it's interesting to think of what that might mean, that this tribe is more organized, more militant. You know, you sort of think of the reforms under Shaka and the Zulus that makes them a more efficient fighting force, developing from the traditional ways of fighting. And we would love to know more about it, but we don't. You have, the details are obscure, there's some annexation of territory, there's some fort building, we've mentioned it. Tacitus is very dismissive of Domitian's military record and success, partly because he wants to contrast it with Agricola. Agricola is the great hero. Agricola is a traditional Roman commander in the best possible mold who wins victories against dangerous enemies and does it in the service of the state. Domitian's a blowhard who's just, boastful, but isn't really achieving anything. And it comes back to all those stories about Caligula and others, faking victories. It's not as extreme. There's probably far more going on under Domitian, but because we don't know enough, we don't know what they were trying to do and how far they actually achieve it. But really the main focus is moving more and more towards the Danube. It's going further south. There have been problems there during the Civil War, a raid by Sarmatians and others, some of whom are caught by one of the armies that's coming to marching to Italy in Vespasian's cause, stumble across Sarmatian raiders and catch them while they're vulnerable and before they're able to retreat, and when they didn't expect to meet any opposition. And think back to our raiding talk of yesteryear. There is an emergence of a very strong kingdom in Dacia. Now, the Dacians had been strong before under Burebista in the 1st century, who was a sort of rough contemporary of Julius Caesar. Caesar was, of course, planning an expedition to Dacia before moving on to Parthia in 44 BC. It's very wealthy, it's got good natural resources, the heartland is in Transylvania. You can see from the archaeology the Dacians are building these very sophisticated and strong forts, walled cities. They're organized, they've got aspects of their own culture that are quite sophisticated, they've got contact with Greek communities on the Black Sea, with the Roman Empire, they're willing to learn from others and adapt. Under Decebalus, you have, again, the first king who's maybe able to unite them to the extent of somebody like Burebista. There seems to have been weaker rulers in between, and it might be this pattern you get in many of these kingdoms, tribal societies, where every now and again you get the strong leader, an Ariovistus, an Arminius, a Maroboduus, people like this. Decebalus is in that mold, and when you have someone like that around who is politically and militarily very, very capable, then they become much stronger, far more challenging as an opponent, as a neighbor. So you get attacks on Lower Moesia. Governor is killed in 85, probably the governor of the province rather than the legate of the legion. Domitian then decides to send an army to deal with this, but puts in command his Praetorian prefect, a chap called Cornelius Fuscus, who's an equestrian. And this, again, it's one of those things where Domitian might feel that this is the man for the job, he really knows what he's doing, and perhaps just think, well, he's very, very loyal to me and he's not a threat like a senator would be, but it annoys the Senate. This is a job that should go to a senator. He is then killed along with the bulk of his army. Now, we've talked in other sessions about the monument at Adam Clissi, and we'll be going back and doing more of that. An unnamed prefect is at the top of the cenotaph there that lists the names of Roman soldiers who have died for the Republic. That prefect, however, was born in Pompeii, resident in Naples, which rather implies that he is born before the eruption of Vesuvius, becomes, perhaps even becomes an adult and is a sort of citizen, a member of the community at Pompeii, but has to move to Naples because, of course, Pompeii isn't there anymore. So that means it's not Fuscus. So although it's a prefect, it's not the Praetorian prefect. And again, we can come on to all of that. We know, again, it's frustrating. These are major conflicts, but we know so little about them. We can't really piece things together. Another army is sent with troops drawn from all over the empire, and Domitian goes, rather like Augustus, not to lead but to supervise within the broader theatre of operations. There are some victories, a peace is negotiated with Decebalus. Decebalus stays there. He is not deposed. He gets a Roman subsidy. He gets technical aid, assistance with artillery, with engineering, architecture. It may not be as much of a failure and a disaster as critics maintain, but this is not an unambiguous Roman success, which is what you want a Roman war to be and what you expect your emperor to deliver. So that it's another reason for senatorial hostility, that Domitian has done these things that are unorthodox and they haven't worked. So he appoints his Praetorian prefect. The Praetorian prefect makes a pig's breakfast of the campaign and dies along with most of his army. You should have sent a senator in the first place, sort of thing. It's setting up conflict for the future, and we'll talk more when we talk about Trajan, about the Dacian wars. I've done the one on Adam Clissi. There's a thing on Trajan's column, a two-parter coming out before too long. So we'll be looking at that aspect of this area, again with the problem that we lack the detailed narrative sources that allow us to be sure about what's going on. So Domitian, he manages to repair some of the damage inflicted by these earlier disasters, but it's not a complete victory. It's basically unfinished business, which is partly why Trajan will turn to this so early on in his reign. In the east, it's largely peaceful after the suppression of the Jewish rebellion. I mean, that takes a few years to take out strongholds like Machaerus and, of course, most famously Masada. Jerusalem falls in 70, and Titus is able to come back so he and Vespasian can celebrate a joint triumph. Masada, again, we could talk about that another day in more detail. You've had the more modern interpretation is that the siege didn't go on quite as long as we used to think, and it's probably not a matter of a year or more, it's probably 6 months or less. But it's still a major enterprise, and even if the ramp is built on an existing spur, it's still an immense task that the army performed. Anyway, we'll come on to that. We'll look at that in more detail, and we'll look at some pictures of it and all that sort of thing another time. Judea is turned into an imperial province governed by a senatorial legatus, appointed by the emperor, who tends to be the commander of Legio X Fretensis. 10th Legion is left there as garrison, and its legate is also the provincial governor. Happens in smaller military provinces where you've just got a single legion garrison. But it's only at this point that you get legionaries stationed in Judea on a permanent basis. From now on, that will always be the case, but again, look at my videos about Pontius Pilate's bodyguard and the Roman soldiers at the crucifixion of Jesus and all this sort of thing. Again and again, people talk about Roman legionaries. These, back in the 30s, these would not have been legionaries. These would have been auxiliary soldiers, because the governor's an equestrian, and they don't. Legions are commanded by senators, with the exception of Egypt, and you don't put a senatorial official underneath the command of an equestrian. Over the course of the Flavians, there's more moves towards more direct rule, more provinces, developments of Cappadocia, Galatia, that area. Again, developments of frontier systems, permanent bases, same sort of thing we've been talking about before. We'll go into more detail at some point. Fewer client kingdoms, fewer dynasts left to run their own affairs. This has been an on-off thing. It's not simple. You've got Herod Agrippa II, lasts into the 90s. He's an old man. And he remains, he's not in Judea, but he does have his own little kingdom. Again, I think we're often too formal in how we think of a clear distinction between a client kingdom and a Roman province. They're all part of Roman's empire, even if one is not directly ruled, but ruled by a man whose authority relies on being appointed by the emperor. So it's rather like talking about Boudica and her husband Prasutagus. Being allowed to choose your own successor was a very rare privilege for these people, which emphasizes that they are a Roman appointee, even if they happen to be a local aristocrat or royal figure. So you have changes, things are going on. The empire is taking a more permanent, settled form. Apart from in Britain, minor expansion on the German frontier, and activities beyond the Danube. But not great expansion there. On the whole, again, the great conquests are largely over. Trajan will be an exception to some extent. There is a sense of the empire settling down to the form it will have for a long, long time under the Flavians. A lot of this is going on, but we don't, again, because we don't have a detailed narrative histories, we can't look at the politics of it all in the same way we can with the Julio Claudians, where we've got Tacitus for at least some of them. So there are weaknesses in the sources. This is an important period, and the Flavians are an important dynasty, but we know much less about them than we would like. So I think we'll finish there for today. We'll be moving on next time. We'll look at resistance, rebellion, and we'll look in some detail, as far as we can, we can't go into an exhaustive detail, at the Jewish rebellion under Nero and how that was suppressed as a sort of case study, really, of how the Romans deal with rebellion, but also how these develop and just who is involved and why. So that's it for today. We've looked at the Flavians, so chronologically we're getting to the end of the 1st century AD, and we're, I suppose, about 3/4 of the way through the Conquered and the Proud series. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching.